speaker series has been going on since 2010, and we hope to include speakers who make us think and have open a dialogue about subject matters that are of interest to us. So we hope that you find tonight's session interesting, thought-provoking, and that you will engage in dialogue tonight here with us and then afterwards. What more important topic than to talk about integration in Columbia and integration in housing? So before I talk about the subject matter, and Milton will come on after me to talk about, introduce the speaker, I want to thank Owen Brown for hosting us tonight, Village of Owen Brown, and they are having their board meeting next door, so I think they are not, none of the board members are here at the moment. Can you all hear me? Okay. I also would like to acknowledge Phil Nichols, who works for the County Executive's Office, is standing in the rear, next to Tom Carvo, who's the head of our Housing Commission. I also, Clarence Lamb, Delegate Lamb, is in the room. Dr. Lamb, thank you for joining us. And also there are several members of the Board of Directors of the CA Board of Directors, and thank you all for coming. Sometimes people ask us, how do we come across the topic? How do we pick the speaker? And sometimes it's just a topic that we find interesting, we think you will, or is a great speaker. And sometimes people ask us, well, why don't you have a certain speaker? And Dan Pontius from the Baltimore Municipal Council, Metropolitan Council. Dan, are you here? Dan here. Dan, for a year, has been saying, you really should bring Rob Braymeyer to speak to the community. And so finally, we're doing it. But thank you very much for introducing us to Rob. So why have we invited Rob to speak to us tonight? Some of you may know Oak Park, Illinois, outside Chicago. You say, well, what does it have in common? Are we the same size? No, they're about 50,000, we're about 100,000. Are they the same size geographically? No, they're much smaller. They're about 4 or 5 square miles, and we're 32 square miles. Is it the age of the community? Is it the location on the edge of the city? No, none of those. Why we're here and want to hear from Rob is because of both being very desirable communities to live in, sought after communities. And one of the reasons they are is that they're integrated communities. And Rob will be talking to you a little bit more about the words that we use, integrated and diverse, later on. Ours is by design, and all of you by now know the history of our community, but ours is done by design at a time that our region and our nation were severely divided and segregated. And of course, some areas are still very segregated. But Rouse had this intentional vision to do this. In Oak Park, you'll hear, they had to be intentional about it. They weren't integrated from the beginning. And it's worked pretty well here in Columbia. We are pretty much diverse, much more diverse than the region as a whole. And Dan was the author of a housing study and plan for the Baltimore region. And it said, that Baltimore as a region still is considered quite segregated, but there are a couple of bright spots, and Columbia is noted in that plan as being one of those multicultural and very diverse communities. So that's part of our legacy, but what about our future? So we're here tonight to understand how we might go forward and make sure that we have continue our integrated community. So before I introduce Milton, who will introduce Rob, our speaker, I wanted to go over some ground rules for this evening. And these are going to be second nature to you, but I just want to go over them. One is that we treat each other with respect, and we refrain from judging other people's expression of their own ideas. They're their own ideas. We also want to allow others time to speak. So after you've spoken, I won't call on you again until others have had their turn. And the third is that tonight, we're focused on fair housing, how to intentionally keep our community racially integrated. So I know many of us are involved in the debate and discussion about affordable housing, but tonight we're not talking about that. We're focused on Rob's expertise in fair housing and that topic for tonight. If at the end of the night we have time, we may take some questions on that, but I hope that you can understand and agreed that we keep the conversation related to the topic. I have your agreement on those now, Jules? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I now introduce Milton Matthews, the President and CEO of the Columbia Association.
Good evening, everyone. I was told not to touch the mic, so I'm not touching. In preparation for this evening, I went to the website of the Oak Park Regional Housing Center, and under the tab of Explore Oak Park, there was a brief, yet what I believe is a very defining statement, description of the village of Oak Park, and it states as follows. Oak Park is a thriving community of more than 52,000 people, known for its architectural heritage and incredible diversity. Within its 4 square miles lives a mix of people of different cultures, races, ethnicity, professions, lifestyles, beliefs, religions, ages, and incomes. I believe that Columbia has a lot of similarities with Oak Park, and for the sake of this evening's event, I want to take the liberty of paraphrasing that statement and adding Columbia to it. And this is what I submit to you. Columbia is a thriving community of more than 102,000 people, known for its many attributes, among which is its incredible diversity. Within its roughly 30 square miles live a mix of people of different cultures, races, ethnicity, professions, lifestyles, beliefs, religion, ages, and incomes. Please consider that while Rob's presentation. In a September 29, 2016 article in the Baltimore Sun, our speaker for the evening was quoted as saying, "To preserve and sustain what we cherish, we must continually investigate best practices." The Columbia community, at almost 50 years in its maturity, is the result of a lot of effort by a lot of people, and the many attributes of the community that we cherish will continue to require our focus. After all, Columbia is the #1 small city to live in the United States. And you know I wasn't Okay, about our speaker this evening. Rob, for the past 10 years, has been the executive director of the Oak Park Regional Housing Center. He leads the nation's most successful effort to promote integration and affirmative furthering of fair housing in the private housing market. Through the efforts of the Housing Center, Oak Park has established and sustained a racially integrated community that has produced multiple benefits for its residents. Rob is the past president of the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance. While there, he oversaw the production of the Fair Housing and Equity Assessment of the Chicago region. This document has been cited repeatedly as a model document on identifying strategies to promote regional equity. Rob collaborates on many national and regional efforts to promote integration, fair housing, and community development. He also has been published in the Cleveland State University Law Review, provides articles and opinion pieces for local newspapers, and has been included and been interviewed for a variety of media outlets, including The Economist, the National Review, NPR, the Chicago Tribune, and recently the Baltimore Sun. He holds a master's degree in geography and planning from the University of Toledo. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Rob Graymeyer.
Well, just let me start by saying I've been here in Columbia now for about a day, and it's been wonderful. It's been really great to be here. I had the chance to have a great conversation this morning with a bunch of people. I've driven all over Columbia and got to see it and see how wonderful this is. And it's clear to me that you guys probably started off better than anywhere else started off when it comes to these kinds of issues and when it comes to just creating community, right? There's such a real, you can feel the intention here in the way the community has been built. So that's really wonderful to be at. It's sometimes I'll be in other communities and we're fighting an uphill battle to begin with, and it's really nice to be in a community where you can see that there's some camaraderie already before I even get here. And So let me tell you a little bit about what we do in Oak Park. So I run a nonprofit organization. I don't work for government. I don't work for quasi-governmental entity. I work for a nonprofit organization that since 1972 has been intentionally promoting the racial integration of our community. When we started in 1972, Oak Park was a well-established community that was 99% white. And it was a community that had this sort of legacy with Frank Lloyd Wright being there for a long time. Ernest Hemingway grew up there. One of the really interesting things to think about when we think about Hemingway is he's sort of famous for this one particular quote, which actually isn't even real, but it's a good kind of snapshot of what he was thinking. When Hemingway grew up in Oak Park, there's this quote you may have heard where he says, "Oak Park is the community of broad lawns and narrow minds." And when he lived there, it was. He lived there, obviously long before we started our integration work. And the community was actually like a really waspy community. It was kind of a snooty community, a place that wasn't really very welcoming to anybody other than, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? And so I only bring that up to tell you that, the Oak Park that people think of today is sort of at polar opposites of that. And it's proof that any community can do this, right? There's not some sort of magic formula, but the way you can do this is by being intentional. So we're going to talk about that tonight. So why do we even care about this in Oak Park, and why do we even get started? Well, go ahead and we'll go to the next slide. It really is because in the late 60s and early 70s, a group of folks in Oak Park recognized that segregation is essentially the structure of inopportunity and inequality and inequity in our society. And they were seeing it take over the city of Chicago, right? And they saw, particularly, Oak Park is directly adjacent to the city of Chicago. We're the first suburb west of Chicago. If you were on the blue line or the green line on the L, you can get to Oak Park. So we're there, we're connected to the city. And the west side of Chicago changed in the 1960s from being almost all white to being almost all black very quickly. And in that process, the communities were basically fleeced. So the white folks sold their homes for less than what they were worth as they left and fled, and African Americans bought homes for more than they were worth when they bought in, and they all lost in that battle, right, and in that outcome. And so Oak Parkers were like, we're not going to let that happen here, right? And over the years, we've looked at that pattern of segregation, and we've noticed how much it correlates with lots and lots and lots of things, right? Segregation is correlated with all kinds of inequalities in our region, in Chicago, and in our country, in pretty much every metropolitan area. And all the things that we think about and all the things we're trying to fix, whether it's issues with police, whether it's issues with housing, whether it's issues with health, whether it's issues with anything that you can think of, schools, those all come back to correlating with that pattern of segregation. So that was a clear thing for us to understand right away. We also know that segregation creates these racial blind spots that people think is self-segregation, right? So self-segregation is really people making a choice because they don't have all the information available to them, right? When you look at the research and when we see people who come to see us, we know that people actually don't want to self-segregate for the most part, but they're not usually aware of their options in places where they're not already in the majority. So they need that extra help, that extra information in order to make those moves. That's part of what we do. And then we also recognize how segregation doesn't just disadvantage people of color. It disadvantages all of us. A really quick way to think about that is in home values, right? We all know how it disadvantages people of color in their neighborhoods of color, right? The home values get depressed, and property values go down, and it's harder to raise taxes in communities that are majority African American because of that, or majority Latino because of that, and it becomes very problematic on a regional basis later on. But what we don't sometimes think about is because white people are essentially not ever looking in those communities, the housing that they are paying for in the communities they will move to costs more when they first buy it. Because real estate agents know there's a whole part, like in Chicago, there's 2/3 of the region you're not even going to look at. So this 1/3 is worth more, right? And so your initial cost for housing is higher if you're white than it should be. Your wealth accumulation doesn't go up as much as it should be for people of color. So we started to recognize all those things. And we also recognized what happened on the west side of Chicago and how that stripped everybody of their wealth, whether they were moving out or moving in. And we said, we don't want that in our community. Okay, so in order to make that not happen, we had to get intentional. I put these 2 quotes up because these are 2 of the people who are in our tradition of what we think is important in the world. You know, and I think it's really important. Now, the Gandhi quote, I think a lot of people know that, you know, our future depends on what we do in the present, right? It's what our actions are today that will change things tomorrow. And King also talked about this in his struggle, and this was particularly true in the North. When King was in the North, what he was fighting for was open housing, right? He didn't have to fight for lunch counter integration. He didn't have to fight for those sorts of things because they were already there in the North. But our housing was really segregated, purposefully, right? So what he was up there fighting for, and he talked about this, you know, that this stuff is not automatic or inevitable. It feels like it sometimes. We all hear the quote about the arc of justice, you know, or the moral arc of the universe, right? Bending towards justice. Well, it doesn't bend towards justice unless we bend it, right? So that's part of why we do what we do too. And we know that if we do that, we can create a more intentional, a more integrated community that will also be more equitable in the long run. I'll get to that towards the end. So I also want to do a little terminology here. This is the boring, pedantic part here, but I do want you to understand that it's really important that we understand what these words mean, at least when I'm talking to you. You can choose your own definitions later if you wish, but when we talk in Oak Park, we talk about diversity as just, you know, if you look at the community as a whole, is it diverse, right? Are there people of different racial groups? And we look at the 4 largest racial groups, right? White, Black, Latino, and Asian. And we say, is there that presence in our community? And is that presence sort of in parity with our region? Does it reflect our region, right? That's one thing to look at. But then the next level of what's even more important than that is it integrated? Do people live physically among one another? Because if they don't, that diversity doesn't really mean much. You can't really create the kinds of things you want to build in a society if you're diverse but you're segregated. So that's a really important part. So when I say integration, I'm talking about us living together, not just that, you know, we have diversity present. And when I talk about diversity, it doesn't necessarily mean it's integrated. The city of Chicago is diverse. It's not integrated. And Baltimore is diverse, right? So Washington, D.C. is diverse. And then inclusion is that next step up. Are we all are part of the society equally, right? Are your elected bodies looking like your community? Are your informal structures looking like your community? Those sorts of things. And then finally, if you can do all of that, you can really get to the point where you're building real equity and people have the same outcomes in the end, right? And then their race doesn't matter in what those outcomes will be. I'm not going to pretend that Oak Park has figured this thing all the way out, okay? But on the first 2, we've done a really good job. On the 3rd one, we're doing a pretty good job. And on the 4th one, we've got work to do. The equity issue. Sorry, I'm probably blocking you. Yes. Okay. So here's an easy way to think about that. Okay? Here's a nice little equation that I hope you'll take home with you. Diversity minus integration equals segregation. Okay? So when people just talk about diversity, they're missing the point. They're only getting halfway there. And that segregation is what we're really dealing with. Segregation is the real way that instability starts to happen. And it's the real way that we start to value one over another. And it makes it very, very easy to do that, right? And you can think about that in places that are really segregated and think about how can these 2 places be, these 2 parts of the same place be so different from one another? How does that happen? Well, that's because that's how segregation works. Okay, it's there to divide us on purpose. Okay, and here is what segregation looks like. This is a very diverse map. Okay, this is the Chicago region. Those areas that are all colored in, that all have the outlines around them, that's the city of Chicago, and then the 77 neighborhoods within the city, okay? And you can see that we have this pattern in Chicago. North side is whiter, South side is more African American, west side a little more African American. You have these lines of Latinos. So you have the white there. So you have the whites are pink, blacks are blue, Asians green, and Latinos are orange. Okay, so you can see this pattern, and you can even see like in how over time, actually, if I were to show you this map, and this is 2010 data, but if I were to show you this map in 2000 or 1990, it wouldn't look much different. If I were to show you this map in 1950, it wouldn't look much different except for there would be fewer orange dots. Okay, and I'm going to walk away from the mic for a second, but like this green area here, this is Chinatown. Right? This somewhat more green area up here is like basically our little South Asia, right? And what we call Devon Street. And then you've got the south side, the west side. You've got these Latino areas that have grown over time that used to be white but have changed to being Latino. You've got some of these older cities on the outskirts that would have been their own city 50 years ago, right? They wouldn't have been part of the Chicago metro area yet. That there's development all the way between them now, right? And these are like 50 miles away practically. And but those older places are another place where the Latino, what we call enclaves in the Chicago area, occur. But this pattern is just stuck in Chicago. And it's been like that for over 50 years, and it was created to be that way. And we know we have to deal with it. So our next equation will be diversity plus integration equals opportunity. So if you take away integration, you get segregation. Add integration, you get opportunity. And this is how we've been able to make diversity something that is an asset for our community. Diversity becomes an asset when you start to integrate it because we start to do things together, right? We start to see a common destiny with one another. And that is really the key to how Oak Park has been able to be a very diverse community and also a very successful and prosperous community. So let's see the map as we zoom into Oak Park. All right, so there's Oak Park, same colors for same people, okay, on the dot density map. On this dot density map, I would think that dot is only one person. So you're not 25 people per dot, you're now one person per dot. But regardless, you can see the pattern, right? We are surrounded by segregated places for the most part. The Chicago to our east, that neighborhood's called Austin. So Austin is 90% African American. It's also quite poor. To the south, Berwyn and Cicero are very heavily Latino, and they're kind of working class, maybe struggling working class for Cicero. Those are at the bottom of the map if you can't see them. To our west, we have this town called River Forest, which is very white, 90% white, very wealthy. The average home price is close to $1 million. And then after you get past Oak Park and River Forest, like the white population disappears again, basically. In Maywood and Bellwood and Melrose Park, they become communities of color. Forest Park is kind of sort of an extension. Oak Park, River Forest, and Forest Park have a lot of sort of common shared things that we have, like our businesses are kind of shared and those kind of things. We don't share any governmental things other than the kids in River Forest and Oak Park go to the same high school. But Forest Park, it was for a long time like where people in Oak Park went to shop. Now we have more shops and things in Oak Park, and we don't do it as much. But so Forest Park is kind of like an extension of Oak Park in a way, and you can see that somewhat there as well. But we're surrounded by this segregation. So we knew if we weren't going to be segregated, we had to put something in place to make that happen, right? To make the integration happen. And to this day, even though we've been doing it for 44 years as a very active thing, people walk in the door and tell us which part of Oak Park they think they should live in, and it's almost always racially coded or racially informed or racially based, right? White people come in and say, I think I should be living in Western Oak Park. I'm looking for an apartment over there. And African Americans will maybe start by saying, well, maybe I could look east of Ridgeland. Ridgeland is this avenue that goes this right here, okay? And Latinos and Asians kind of follow the same pattern as whites. That should probably be further west if I can, right? So we have to talk to them. not just give them listings, but we actually have to have a conversation with them about how that isn't correct and that the whole community is available to them. So how do we do that? Okay, so we're proactively working with housing seekers in our community, particularly apartment seekers. Okay, Oak Park is about 40% rental, 39% rental. And we are helping, anybody who wants to find an apartment in Oak Park can come to us, and we will help them find an apartment. Now, if they can afford it, right? Because we're also proactively working with the landlords in the community. We don't own or manage a single unit. All we are is a service to help them find an apartment. And all the owners are giving us their listings. Well, almost all the owners are giving us their listings. And so we're connecting them together, right? It's a really great model because if you come in and you tell me I can afford $1,000 for an apartment and I want these things in it, we're going to give you rentals that are $1,000 or less per, and with the things that you want. So the landlord loves us when we send you to them because they know if you got sent by the housing center, this is somebody who can afford my apartment. And the tenants love us because they know that I'm not going to be going somewhere where I'm going to be wasting my time talking to a landlord where I thought the rent was going to be this and it ends up being that, or I thought it was going to be this nice and it was not, or those kinds of things. So it's a really great strategy because it makes everything easier for everybody. But the other thing that's really important about it is that it's there before the move happens, right? The traditional fair housing model is let's wait until somebody complains about being discriminated against and then we'll try to help them with that, which is a long process. Trust me, I used to do it. You would get a complaint, and even if it was a slam dunk case, you were 2 years before you'd get to a resolution. And to help somebody get to a resolution about whether or not they can rent an apartment 2 years later is not a very helpful resolution, right? So I remember being a little fed up with that when I was doing that. Still did it, we still worked hard, and people's rights need to be defended, so if somebody comes with a complaint, we need to have that mechanism in place. But it was clear to me, and it was clear to the people in Oak Park, separately, that that reactive model isn't going to do it. That's not going to get us integration, right? We have to have something where we're doing something in the beginning so that we can build that kind of, build the community that we want, not complain about the community that we don't want, right? So we're working with the tenants and they can all come to us, and as long as they can afford to live in Oak Park, and we work our hardest to make sure that we can do that for them. It's not always going to happen, but we have other mechanisms in the community to help with some affordability in certain cases, but the racial integration is really what it's all about. And we're trying to help them find the apartment that works for them. We're working with the landlords and telling them about fair housing compliance so they make sure they do all that stuff, but we're also, really importantly, explaining to them how racial integration in their building is going to be good for their business model, right? If you have people of all races interested in renting your building, that means the whole market is coming to you, not just part of the market, right? And even if the part of the market was white people before, that's still only part of the market, and there's greater demand for you out there. And if you can do that and you keep your building well maintained and you follow fair housing protocols, you will be able to have a very successful building. You will, and you work with us, you're going to just get this great service of more tenants rolling in all the time, right? When we have you can rent, there's about 9,000 rental units in Oak Park. So we expect about 3,000 to 3,500 of them to rent every year because you're going to have about a 1/3 turnover. And we're going to help rent 1,000 of them, okay? In a slow year, maybe 800. So, and in a good year, maybe 1,500. So we're having a very big impact for these owners. And we're obviously a clearly good resource for the people who are looking to move to the community. And that's why everyone keeps working with us. But we're not stopping there. We're also coordinating with everybody else in the community, right? In Illinois, it's almost the opposite of Maryland. We have thousands of, it feels like, but we do have over a half a dozen taxing bodies in Oak Park, right? We have our village board, which is our municipal government. We have our township government. We have a library board. We have a park district board. We have an elementary district. We have a high school district. We have other things as well. And so we have to coordinate with all of them to make sure that they're taking part in this strategy as well, right? Is the park district making sure that it's maintaining all the parks equally? Is the school district making sure that the 8 elementary schools in town are all getting the resources they need and that the students are doing just as well? Is the village making sure that it's providing its services evenly? And in a lot of cases, we talk about like, actually what you really need to be doing is making sure that the eastern part of Oak Park is even better than the rest of the community. So that the stereotype and perception can't be upheld that that part is worse because it's closer to Chicago, right? So that's really important. All right, so we're doing all of that work. And then, if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about, besides just the nuts and bolts of what's going on, why does this matter in the big picture of how you deal with this issue, right? Well, again, the old fair housing strategy is, let's wait until something goes wrong and we'll try to remedy it. And that strategy has a couple of flaws with it. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it anymore, but I'm just saying like it alone doesn't work because of a couple of things. One, it doesn't allow for white people to be involved. They feel like that kind of model is irrelevant to them, right? They're never going to sue for their fair housing rights. They might be sympathetic to fair housing rights. I'm sure that I've met people along the way that are really sympathetic, but then they're sort of like, I don't really know what's in it for me though, right? And so I'm never going to be against it, but I'm not going to be for more, right? Well, when we talk about integration, white people have a role to play, right? You can't have an integrated community without white people too. So now they have some part in this process. They have some way to be involved that's relevant to them. You start talking about all those benefits that everybody gets out of it. We start talking about how that's going to get us to where we want to be as a community. All of a sudden, they're not irrelevant and off on the side. They're actually in the game, right? They're part of what we're trying to do. So that's a really important thing because whether we like it or not, that's where a lot of what can happen is going to happen, right? If white people think it's important, they will put their resources, of which they have most of the resources, right, behind that effort, right? So that's really important for that. It might sound a little cynical, but it's actually, long term, right? The other thing is we can build something that's more aspirational rather than adversarial, right? We're not trying to figure out how to pit one group against another. We're trying to figure out how we can all work together on this, right? We all have this role to play, and we all have a benefit that we're going to get from it. So let's talk about that, and let's talk about how we need to work together in order to create that, right? And it's got to go all the way, as I'll show you later, all the way up to the top of the pyramid. It can't just be part of the way. But as people understand what their role is in it and what their benefit is in it, they want to be part of it. They can start to see that, oh yeah, I can do this part, I can be that part. So whether it's an institution that has a role to play or it's an individual that has a role to play, you can figure that out because we're all going for something together. We're collaborating, we're not fighting with each other. And then this ends up being a structural fix, right? Because as we work together, we're changing those structures and systems, right? We're making sure that they're inclusive and that they're supposed to have equitable outcomes. So you're starting to build a structure of opportunity rather than dealing on the back end and just helping individuals one by one, right? And that's, unfortunately, something that is really problematic in our society. We don't think about the structures a lot. Instead, we think about, well, something bad happened here and we need to fix that, right? Well, we do need to fix the bad things that happen, but we also need to build structures to keep bad things from happening. So that's really important as well. So I just want to also walk you through a little model of how this works and how it makes a difference in an individual's life, and then it ends up being a structural change, right? So another way to look at this is we're leveraging individual choices and creating a structure of change, a structure of opportunity. In a typical housing search, this is how it works, and we know this from both data on, from like research that people have done, but also like the data that we have from the last 10 years of data in our database, and from other places that we've talked to. But a tenant begins a search. Anybody ever heard of implicit bias? I'm sure you have. live in Columbia, and you're all aware of these kinds of things, right? So implicit bias fits in with housing search too. People have implicit biases before they move somewhere. They may ignore a community, or they may not know about a community, and they have those racial blind spots. And so that colors where they're, or, has a role to play and where they're going to look for housing, right? And these stereotypes end up limiting their options. Of course, people of color are going to probably face discrimination along the way as well when they're starting to look for a place to live. So in our model, we're always giving people information about what their fair housing rights are, how they can remedy them. Our community has a community relations commission that will hear complaints of fair housing. We have an adjudication process within it. If that isn't good enough, you can go to our county's adjudication process, or you can go to HUD. And all of those options are laid out there, as well as information about all the fair housing enforcement agencies they could choose from. Well, if you don't have those two things in place, then the search is going to exclude most of what we call affirmative options, options where they're going to create integration, either promote it or sustain it. And so if they don't have those options out there, what they're going to end up doing is making a move that's going to reinforce segregation. And we know this happens. We know from data where people follow folks from one census to the next, that white people move from a census tract that's more African American or less white than the census tract they leave only 10% of the time, right? So they hardly ever move to a census tract that's less white than the one they just moved from, because of all of these reasons, right? African Americans do the same thing. Only 30% of the time do they move to a tract that's less black than the one that they just left. So we don't have data on the other two groups yet. So, but we do have data on those two groups over the census. And so it's really important, because then that status quo is going to continually persist the inequality in our society, right? Because that inequality is all based on that pattern of segregation. Now, when they come to us, this is where things change, right? We're going to disrupt all of those implicit biases and racial blind spots. When I walk through the door, I'm going to be told about places that I wouldn't have thought about otherwise. I'm going to be given options where I'm going to integrate that building, as is every one of our clients, right? So they're going to be told about those places first. There might be some others that will be available to them if they come back for more listings and that kind of stuff, but they're going to get at least 6 listings. That's really all they're ever going to need, because they get exactly what they're looking for. And they're going to be listings that are hopefully going to integrate the community if they make that move, right? So and then when we give them that listing and they say, oh, well, I don't know if I want to live over there. Right? Now that's when the conversation comes in. Why? What makes you think you wouldn't want to live there? Well, I've heard that the crime's a little higher over there. Well, let's get out the map. Let's get out the data. And you can see that crime is pretty much not a big deal anywhere in Oak Park. So particularly, compared to the other choices that you're going to be thinking about. One of my favorites is there's a couple of Northside neighborhoods that people will ask them, well, would you move there? And one's called Andersonville, which just from the name you can probably understand is mostly white. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a great neighborhood. Well, guess what? The crime's higher in Andersonville, right? So now that argument's out the window. Well, I don't know, are the schools as good over there? Well, let's look at the data. Yeah, the schools are as good over there. And on and on and on. We have a rebuttal for every one of these kinds of things that we know is going to happen. They're going to bring them up. Not everybody's going to bring them all up, but they're going to bring at least one of them up. So we're ready for that. With the data and with a staff that knows the community, has lived in the community, and can say about their own personal experience. Well, actually, the street that divides us is called Austin Boulevard from Chicago. And they can say, well, actually, I've lived on Austin Boulevard for the last 15 years, and I've never had a problem. Oh, like that means something to people. Or if an African-American family comes in and says, well, are you sure that I can live in Northwest Oak Park? Like, I'm going to be accepted. My son's not going to be, pointed out. Yeah, well, this is the kind of community where we don't do that kind of thing. You're not going to be isolated. You're not going to be harassed. I will say that's not exactly perfect, but it's definitely better than anywhere else they're going to live in the Chicago region as far as how they're going to be perceived when they live in our community. then they're also, of course, informed about their fair housing rights if they're a person of color, or they're a family with children, or they're a person with disabilities, et cetera. And now they've got moves that will actually expand their choice and become affirmative and build integration in our community, or sustain our integration in our community. And that promotes the integration, and that's furthering our goal of having a fully equitable community, which we're still working toward, right? But we wouldn't even be able to do that if we didn't have this process in place. Okay, so how's it changed over the years, right? I told you we were 99% white when we got started. And so these graphs have the same, well, they're actually slightly different color scheme, but whites are blue on this one. And you can see we've changed from being 99% white to 64% white. We've changed from being 0% African American to 21%, 0% Latino to 7, and 0% Asian to 5, okay? So we're probably doing pretty good, it seems like, right? Well, let's measure that against the region. So what's the region look like? Well, we're pretty close on 3 out of 4, right? So for whites, African Americans, and Asians, we're pretty close as to what you would expect parity-wise. For Latinos, we're way low, okay? However, that's changing, and like I put this little note on here that like our school-age population is a little bit closer, but it basically, the one thing that we know we're having trouble with is how are we promoting our community to Latinos, right? Are they feeling like it's a community that they can live in and feel comfortable in? Actually, if you want to go back one more, stay on there for a little bit. But I also want to emphasize that like those numbers that are the regional numbers, the yellow lines, are not necessarily like hard and fast, right? Like we don't say, oh, we're not 53, so we failed, right? Or, you know, the black population went down to 17%, so we've got to figure out what to do. Or it went up to 28%, right? If it gets way off, then we wonder what are we doing to make the community feel unwelcome to one group, or we're overcompensating for another group, right? But if it's, you know, within that range, then we feel like, okay, we've built a community that's reflective of the region that we live in. So that means that all of the racial groups are coming to look for housing in Oak Park and are able to make that move, right? I'm not saying everybody is always going to be able to move to Oak Park, because some people can't afford to live there. Some people might not be able to find the type of house they want there. There's all sorts of reasons. But for the most part, people can move to Oak Park and they can make that. And it's not a racial bias thing that's keeping them from being able to buy a home or rent an apartment in Oak Park. So here's another thing that we love to talk about in Oak Park. So this, I am not an economist, so I always have trouble describing this graph. But what we did here, with the help of an economist, is look at the total assessed value of real estate in our community for the last 40 years. So in 1980, in 1990, 2000, 2010, we looked at what the assessed value was for the community. Basically, what is our property worth? And we mapped that out, and then we standardized it so that it's all set to $2010 to adjust for inflation. And then we made it on a percentage scale so we can show you on the same map, or same graph as what we have for the white population percentage. So you can see the gist of it is, as we became less white, we became more prosperous, which is exactly what we hoped. We wanted to be able to make sure that we could prove that you can create a community that is reflective of America and remains thriving and prosperous. That was really important to us, because everybody thinks you can't. Everybody thinks that when more people of color move to town, you're going to be poorer, and we are not. And it's really important. When I come to other communities that have never even thought about this before, and then we start talking about it, they are blown away by this graph. They can't believe that it's even possible. They wonder if I'm telling the truth. And but there it is. And you know, it's the real data. I use because we have our own township. We have a township assessor, right, who has all that data, you know, in both handwritten form and on paper and on electronically. So we can really look back and see what's happening. And this is a really good growth for our region as well. It's not like we lagged behind in growth either. So it's a fantastic thing, and it's really important for us to shout that out. You can be a thriving and diverse community. But the reason we are is because we focused on integration. because nobody ever thought one part of the community was changing in a way that it wasn't the same as it was before, right? And that's kind of the thing that we would have to deal with if it was segregated. Not because we feel that way in our own community, but because that's how society would look at our community, right, from the outside. So here it is, those same sort of things that I defined for you before, now on what we call the pyramid of progress. Our belief is that as we build on these things, we can do the next. And as we work our way up the pyramid, we will be more and more prosperous. We will be better off as a community, and that's really important to us. So we're also building towards racial equity, but we're building towards the best community we can be at the same time, right? And so, you know, it begins with that diversity. That diversity has to get integrated. The integration means that we can build inclusion, because when we live among one another, we can start building that social integration too, right? We start to empathize with one another. We start to see what we all have in common. But we also start to understand what the different barriers are for each of us, right? I mean, I can walk down my block and I can see people of every racial group in it. I can have a conversation with those folks, and we can all talk about how we care about our kids the same way. We can all talk about, you know, whose lawn is best mowed or whatever. Mine's usually not. And we can talk about other things like that, and all that stuff is either like kind of little stuff or big stuff that we all have in common. But if we get a little bit deeper in those conversations, and we try to put these kinds of things in place in our community to make that happen, we can also start to recognize, like, the path it took for me to get to Oak Park might have been different than it would have been for my neighbor of a different race, or, you know, et cetera. Or, you know, Oak Park is also like a super friendly LGBT community, so we have, you know, same-sex couples on our block as well, right? And those sorts of things. So we can all talk about that and learn a little bit about, even though we all have the same aspiration and we all have a lot in common and we all want the same thing for our community and our kids and et cetera, we didn't all get here in the exact same way, and we all have different things that we have to try and overcome in order to make that happen. So that's really important. But you can't get there if I live in one part of town and, you know, people who don't look like me live in a different part of town, right? You just won't build that kind of camaraderie. You won't build that kind of empathy with each other. We know because there's another community in the Chicago region called Evanston, which has almost the exact same racial demographics as us, but it's twice as segregated. So it's almost like the city of Chicago segregated. And there is tremendous racial tension in that community. There's no sense of like people feeling like they're all part of one Evanston. You're either this part of Evanston or that part of Evanston, and you're very clear to tell people where you live in Evanston and those kinds of things. And at the same time, they all care about the diversity, but they all sort of understand that like there's more than one Evanston essentially, right? Nobody feels that way in Oak Park. I mean, relatively nobody, right? And I mean, no community is perfectly ubiquitous, but you know, most of us feel like no matter where we live in Oak Park, no matter who we are in Oak Park, we're part of one community. For instance, we elect every single body at large, purposefully, so that everybody has to represent everybody's interests, right? I was talking like on that inclusion part and sharing in the power. I was telling the group this morning, we have these like local parties. We don't have Democrats and Republicans in Oak Park. We're a kooky town, and the one that's been there for the longest is called the Village Managers Alliance. It was formed in the 50s to root out corruption and, you know, make it so that basically our elected officials only hire the village manager, right? They can do policy work, but they don't do any day-to-day work. They don't hire anybody. There's no corruption, right? So that one's lasted the longest, and there's a few others that pop up here and then. They just sort of identify a slate of independent candidates they think are the good candidates, right, for you to vote for this time. It would be nuts and almost like political suicide for them to endorse a slate of candidates that was monoracial. They just, like, it would be, I'm actually on the selection committee for the VMA this time, and I know that we'll have this discussion, even if like we think like the best three candidates are all one racial group, we won't do that. We won't endorse all three of the same race. We will make sure that there is a difference, because we know that those voices have to be heard. And also we know that the community would be like, what the heck's wrong with this group? They didn't do what we are supposed to do. right? I mean, it really would be like, I can imagine what the local paper would be like the next week after that was announced. So it's really ingrained in the community at this point. I'm not pretending it's a utopia, but the intention is there, and it's there, and it's getting better all the time because it's there, right? So I think the next few slides are taking us away from Oak Park and bringing us to this region. I looked at Baltimore and not DC. I know you guys are sort of halfway between, and some of you are more DC oriented and some of you are more Baltimore oriented. But Dan's the person that introduced me, so you got Baltimore. So Baltimore doesn't look a whole lot different than the Chicago region, right? It's pretty segregated. You can see that the blue and pink dots are pretty much apart from each other, right? And you guys have fewer green and orange dots than we do, but you know, they're pretty much in the same kind of isolation they are in the Chicago map, right? There's certain spots where they show up, and they're kind of congregated in one spot, right? Well, let's zoom in to Columbia. And you can see that Columbia has all the dots. They're all there, right? And you know, because Rouse started this program, this community, before the Fair Housing Act, you know that you guys did really super intentional things, right? Like thinking about house by house, who should be living there, right? And making really intentional decisions about it. And that was a really great platform to build from, right? If you want to keep that vision alive, if you want to keep pushing forward on that, you're going to have to continue to be intentional. One of the things that we found in this situation is there actually used to be a group of suburbs all across the country, mostly in the Midwest and the Northeast, that were called the Oak Park Exchange Congress. There were a bunch of mostly suburbs who were working on trying to make sure their communities could be integrated. And they would learn from each other and share best practices and models that were working. And they didn't just look at housing, they looked at community development and schools and public safety and all sorts of things. But housing was always at the core, and the Housing Center was always the sort of coordinating entity. Every other year they'd meet in Oak Park, and every other year they'd go to one of the other communities. And so a number of those communities were in the Congress from like the late 70s to the early 90s, sometimes to the mid 90s, late 90s, and they got to a point where they looked like Oak Park or like Columbia. They were diverse communities, and they're like, we made it, all right. And they stopped. They stopped spending money on stuff, they stopped putting programs in place, and they segregated. Sometimes did what we call resegregated, which means most of those communities were like Oak Park. They started as all white, and they became more diverse and more integrated. But then when they stopped, then white flight, it just was like they delayed white flight. It didn't end, it just waited until they stopped doing the work they were doing. So what we know is that this sort of perpetual intentionality is really important if you want to be able to keep it up. And so even in Oak Park, we had a period for, like, out of the 10 years that I've been here, sort of the middle 5, I would say, were sort of this period where I felt like the community was getting really complacent. We were sort of, it was harder for me to get the funding that we needed. It was harder for us to get community forums and get people out to them. What we had happen was a lot of people had moved to the community at that point that didn't know anything different than the Oak Park that we already created, right? They weren't there when Oak Park was 90% white. They weren't there when Austin changed from 90% white to 90% black in 5 to 10 years, right? They didn't know any of that, and they didn't understand the kind of work we put in to make this happen, right, and to keep it going. So the last couple of years, we worked really hard on trying to, like, okay, we've got to start talking to people who are younger than me about, I'm 45, 46, you know, about why you moved to this community, right? You know why you moved to this community. You moved to the community that you wanted, that reflected your values, right? But do you understand what goes into that? It isn't just magic. It isn't just something in the water. There is an intentional effort in the community to make this happen and to keep it going. So, you know, that's the most important message, really, is that if this is what you value and this is what you care about, then you have to be intentional about continuing to sustain it. And you can, because you've got the right base for it. You've got the community built right. you've got the institutions that care about it, you've got the people who live here who came here because of this, and you just have to put that into action, right? So if you go to the next slide, just thinking about what could happen here, right? Thinking about why this is important, right? Look, every community in America is going to be more diverse, right? It's just where we're going, right? Our whole population is going to be more diverse. The question is, are we going to prepare for it to make it an asset, or are we going to just wait for it to happen and not know what might be the result, right? And will you lose what you value most in that change, right? Could the community start to segregate? And then now it's not Columbia, it's different places in Columbia, right? You guys, as I said, you've got this sort of great head start because you were built this way, and you have people who moved here because of this, right? So you guys are ready, and I can tell you right now, it's going to be a competitive advantage for you. It probably already is, but it'll be even more so if you start to really trumpet it and make it the core of what you do. Because there are people who are out there who are searching for these kinds of communities, and they don't have many to choose from. And you guys are like in the perfect position, right? You're halfway between DC and Baltimore. There's a bunch of really progressive people who want to find a community like this. And they need to know it's out here and that you care about it and that you're going to invest in it to sustain that, right? Then they'll be here. It's going to be a good thing for you. Like I said, those other ones that didn't keep intentional, they lost their integration. And so they lost what turns diversity into an asset for their community. And then, again, remember, it's an aspirational model. It's going to appeal to people's social needs and their practical needs, right? Again, how do we, we're all involved. We all have something to do here. And we're all going to prosper because of it, right? We're going to create a community that's going to be good for all of us. Everybody has a role to play. And it's proving that diversity and prosperity can coexist, which is really, really important. Because if we can do this in more communities in America, it will start to become the norm rather than segregation, right? Once people start to recognize, like, hey, you can have diverse and integrated communities. And they can be really prosperous. They can have good schools, and they can have, wonderful parks, and they can be great places to live, and my house is going to gain in value, and this is really wonderful. We should do more of this, right? Like, that's what developers do, right? They look for trends, and they follow those trends, and they try to find them. Well, our trend in America for the last, how old are we now? Is to segregate, right? Particularly after the Civil War, like, it's very much about segregating. So we can show this other model. And once that starts to become more and more popular, more and more communities are going to want to do it, and we can change America, right? So I think you might want to think about, I know I've learned a lot from being here about what you guys are doing, and I'm going to take some of that back to Oak Park, but I would love it to hear, what do you think Columbia can learn from us, or what do you think might be good for us to share with you? And then it'd be really interesting to hear if you think something similar should be implemented here. Would you guys think that a housing center could work in Columbia? Could it help make sure that you can sustain things that you hold most dear, so that you can have the community that you most want? So I'll leave you with those two questions and just let you sort of ask me things. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff you're wondering about, because even though I try to make it as explanatory as possible, there's always more.
Thank you. Please give another round of applause to Rob. I'm going to call on you. I'll try to kind of point out you and then you and you, kind of like that, so you know that you'll be called on. And we'll look forward to Rob answering those questions. So, who's first?
Hi, David Off from Upland Mills. Thanks so much. That was a great, really inspiring talk. But the island nature of our little communities is really, really distressing, right? Looking at those maps and looking at how rare these kinds of places are after all these years. So, I mean, one obvious lesson is everyone who has any goodwill about this wants to try and replicate some kind of nonprofit organization and communities dedicated to inclusion. And that's great. And obviously, our billionaires in the country have been remiss in not funding this sort of thing. And we They
I
can
agree.
balance, and it's all that's great. But I'm wondering what kind of a role, I mean, where do people go for advice about where to live? They go to realtors.
Right.
What kind of role do you see in a, how can we have a big effort to reform the realtor
Yeah.
profession so that they care about this stuff and don't push everyone in the other direction, which is much more usual.
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. So in Oak Park, I told you, we mostly are doing this for folks looking for an apartment. So the other, what did I say, 40%, other 60% of the market is being handled by the real estate community. Well, what we do on a regular basis, annually, the bigger real estate offices in Oak Park, and for us, that's really not like a half a dozen. We train them every year on this strategy. This is what Oak Park's about. When you get a couple coming in and telling you they only want to live in one part of Oak Park, we need you to give them other options. Of course, you're going to give them what they want, but please try to push them a bit to think about other parts of the community as well, so that they don't just have that limited situation. So that's part of how it works. I have to say, like, the real estate community is a little bit more constrained than I am as a nonprofit to be able to do what we do. They have to, have to, too strong a word, but they choose to, and they are informed that they should, and this includes from the fair housing community, just sort of never talk about these issues, right? Don't ever talk about race, don't ever talk about school, don't ever talk about any of these things, because you could get in trouble, right? You could get in trouble. Well, you could get in trouble if you told a white family, like, you don't want to go over there, that's where there's more black people. That's steering you. But if a family came to them and said, we're really looking for a community where our child will grow up in a diverse environment and have, friends of all different groups. Can you help us find that neighborhood? They are perfectly justified in helping you find that neighborhood, but they don't think they are. They think that they shouldn't, right? So trying to work on that education-wise is really important, but I have to tell you that's not just an education for the real estate community, it's an education for the fair housing community as well. Because I was in that part of the fair housing community for the first 10 years of my career, where I did investigations of discrimination, and I helped do testing, coordination, and all that kind of stuff. And when we trained with fear. Don't do anything or we will sue you, right? And that is that adversarial old model that doesn't necessarily make real change. It just keeps people from making any effort, right? So there's more for us to do sort of systemically as far as how we deal with the real estate community. But in Columbia on your own, you could try and look for the real estate agents. I'm sure there's probably agents in this room, but there's certainly agents in the community who live here and sell homes here, who believe in what Columbia is about, and those are where you start. You start saying, like, we need you to make sure, even if you don't have the conversation with them, make sure that they don't look in just one village. Make sure that they look in a few different villages. And try to make that work towards our integration strategy if you can. It's still up to the homeowner where they're going to live in the end, but if you give them those extra options, we can have it. I mean, the real estate community, if they were working on this issue, right? I mean, around the country, first of all, there's one housing center in the whole country, right? Ours. And there's, in the fair housing world, there's like maybe 150 fair housing organizations in the country, right? Most of which just do enforcement, a few of them which try to do some other proactive things. Probably no more than 2 dozen do really proactive things. So if we got real estate agents involved, we have hundreds of thousands of people working on this issue. We could probably fix this problem in a couple of years, right? But we've been working on it for 44 years as a fair housing community, and we haven't gotten very far. But the real estate community is, like you said, where everybody goes for advice. And if their advice was, here's how you can integrate, that'd be like an army of integrationists that would be able to change our reality very quickly. So it's really important that we try to figure out those solutions.
Thank you. And then Nancy.
Hi, my name is Tina. I live in Wild Lake, and I wanted to ask about the transition from homeownership or from rent to homeownership.
Yeah.
So I'm going to come. I'm going to rent in Oak Park for 3 years, and then I'm going to go buy a house. Do I leave Oak Park? Do you have data trending on that?
We don't have the greatest data on that. Our data is mostly people don't really like to follow up with us like that. They look at us like a retail establishment. So they basically are like the same way you delete every email from Amazon and ask you how your service was. When we call people up and say, did you like what we did for you, most of the people delete that email, right? So, or they don't hang up, or they hang up the phone, that kind of thing. So we don't get like as robust data as we want, but we do know that a lot of the people who are homeowners in Oak Park were first renters in Oak Park. We get that information from our own interrelationships with people, and we get that data from when we actually try to find it. Like we'll actually sometimes, purposefully, like at events or whatever, say, how did you first move to Oak Park? We really want to go and say, we used the housing center to find the first apartment. Sometimes they just say, we were first rented and then we bought. So yes, they do, and it's really important because that rental situation to homeownership situation, what we're doing is doubly good, right? First of all, rental is so important to our community, right? It's the way people are first introduced to it. And then creating the integration in the rental market means that when that person becomes a homeowner, they will look in the neighborhood where they rented as well, right? So if we weren't doing this and we had segregation in our rental market, the segregation in the homeownership market would follow, because people would still have that blind spot, right? So it's really important that we're doing that. And we know that, obviously rental is, a 1 to 5 year commitment, right? And homeownership is a 10 to 50 year commitment. So people often rent first to see, is this the community for me? Particularly in a community like this, where it's different than anywhere else, right? So you might want to test it out, even though you think it's what you want. This sounds great, but maybe we'll rent for a year and just make sure it's great before we buy. So it's an important part of the whole infrastructure.
I'm the realtor in the room. Probably one second. But I have a couple things I want to say. I live on one of the first streets in Columbia, and there are some black families that were there from the very beginning, and apparently the story that they've told us is that James Rouse went to Baltimore, and he got families to move from Baltimore to Columbia from the very beginning. And I mean, it might work in other cities to just initiate that sort of thing, to bring people so that they can feel more comfortable. It's just another thought. The thing about what you were talking about realtors, I happen to have sold a home to somebody who worked from DOJ, who was one of those people who traveled around the country, who told me the stories about they do exactly that. And they would take it right to the end of the settlement table and say, aha, we were just checking, and either things aren't good or things are good. You can only hope things are good, but they walk out the door and the seller still has a house to sell. So yeah, it's an adversarial way of doing it.
Yeah.
But at any rate, it's kind of interesting. But in Columbia, frankly, it is not an issue. Yes, we do take the fair housing classes and we understand all that. But there isn't a street or a part of Columbia that I haven't shown or sold, and it's totally regardless of who lives there. We mostly don't even know when we're showing the property.
Yeah, that's great. That's
So
fantastic.
this is very different from Oak Park.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in Oak Park, we definitely have agents who do just what you just said, which is because we're working on them. That whole idea of like going and finding people and telling them that this community wants you, that's really important, right? So the way we market the community is we market it in 3 ways, right? 1, it's the greatest place you could ever live, right? 2, it's an open and inclusive community. We're tied, let's say. So, but we say we're the greatest place to ever live. You guys should say the same thing. And we say it's also this community that's committed to being open and inclusive. And we have all of these amenities, right, that we have. So that's how we market the community, so that everybody sees a message in there for them, right? And then, if we need to, if we have an underrepresented group, then we go look for ways to connect to that group, right? So right now with Latinos, we'll go and, I have a long history now in the Chicago region of working on housing issues, so I know all of the Latino serving housing agencies, right? I can talk to those folks and say, Do these people know that Oak Park's an option? When you're doing your home ownership counseling, do they know that Oak Park's an option? When you're doing your rental counseling, do they know, or do you only show them the neighborhoods that you're located in, right? And then they will, oftentimes they hadn't thought about it. They only were showing the neighborhoods they were located in, which meant they were perpetuating segregation as well. And then once they have thought about it, they're like, oh yeah, you know what, we'll send some people out to Oak Park. We'll send some people to the village communities so that we can be part of that too. So yeah, actually, purposefully looking for the people who are underrepresented is really important. Also remembering that people have different interests in integration, right? And the group that has the least amount of interest in integration is white people. So you've got to keep your eye on them all the time, right? You've got to be encouraging them to be part of it. One of the most important things about what we do is we get white people to participate in integration. That's not easy. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. We in Columbia, actually, you hit a spot on, because we often talk these days that there is a group of people we call the pioneers who came here to build a great place. And now we have this wave of people who come to live in a great place, but they don't have the same investment or knowledge or sense that they need to participate in the continuing building and recreating of this great place. So I think there is a big place for that. And we have a nonprofit, it's called the Columbia Association, that I think could have a big role, because there are many of us, and I'm on the board of CA, who believe that one of CA's main purposes, besides hosting great speakers and having great pools in every neighborhood, is to be the stewards of Columbia's values and vision, and being part of something like this would be a big part of it. Related to that, I wanted to ask you about Oak Park a little bit. I have a little different definition of inclusion. My work is about creating diversity and inclusion in organizations. And what we talk about inclusion is when people can have an impact, not just when people interact, but when people's difference can make a difference. So could you tell us a little bit from your observations or what you know, how is Oak Park a truly multicultural community that expresses the multiculturalism, not just with we have this party or whatever, but where people's difference can truly make a difference in the mores, the fabric of the society, as versus just simply being a lost community that happens to have people of color.
Right. Yeah, no, so I mean, it starts with making sure that, the representation is there, right? So again, our elected boards and things like that are all integrated so that those perspectives will be at a position of power, right? So that's important. We have been doing more and more, our community gets affected by national things as well as anybody else. And so, Black Lives Matter has had a big impact in our community. And it's changed some of the ways that we do things. There have been, for instance, in our high school, which is not as integrated as we'd like it to be. I mean, it's diverse, but we have issues with achievement gaps, which I'm going to bet you have too, and because every community does, and those sorts of things. And we've been able to, over the recent, couple of years, start to have things where, students of a particular race are able to meet on their own, which used to be anathema in Oak Park, right? We could never do that, right? Because then you're segregating, right? Well, there are points at which these things are important so that people can do this, have that space, right? But we think about an integration lens on everything that we're doing, right? So when we think about economic development, we think, okay, is this going to be somewhere? Are we looking for small business people of every racial group, right? And are we providing the kinds of businesses that everybody group? Now again, we can do better on all these things. I don't want to pretend like we're perfect. So we're doing that. In the school system, we're thinking about, all of our 8 elementary schools pretty much look the same. The one that's in far northwest Oak Park, which is the wealthiest, whitest part of the community, is a little bit different. But the other 7 pretty much look almost exactly the same. Well, knowing that that one school is kind of an outlier, and that like the PTO has more money and things like that, the school district thinks about its resource allocations in that way. And the school board makes sure that there's voices, reflective in each one of the elementary schools, right? Our congregations are starting to work on this more and trying to create ways to connect the racial integration, with the equity issues that they're really tied up in, right? And whenever we have, like, you know, like if I were to do this in Oak Park, sometimes I would do it by myself, but most of the time I would be sure to make sure that I'm not doing it alone, because we want to have a multiracial group up in front so that we can hear everybody's perspective about how they feel about it, right? And sometimes I find out that what I thought was going really well isn't going so well. And that's important because we can't fix it unless we don't. So all of that is happening, and it's getting better. In fact, it's accelerating at a really great pace right now in our community, to make sure that all these different voices are heard, and that we actually listen to them, right? They're not just heard and we ignore it later, right? You don't just have somebody come up and say, you know, I feel like my kid's not getting a fair shake in the school district. And everyone's like, oh, that guy's just complaining. Like, you know, well, like, if they can explain why, then we need to figure out what's wrong and how to fix it, right? So there's a value in everybody's voice, I guess. And again, that can be improved, but it's, I think, compared to anywhere else, it's really, I mean, if I think about it compared to the city of Chicago and what's happened there, you know, all these people of color speaking about what's happening in their communities and really just being ignored by the mayor and the others, who are actually, like, not bad as a mayor, to be honest with you. I mean, he gets a lot of bad press, but, you know, he's done some good things too, but he doesn't really listen to the community. He just does what he wants to do, and that's not going to get you to where you want to be.
John Ishimasa, one of the things that we're fortunate to have here in Columbia is economic diversity that crosses the racial lines. So we have very wealthy black families as well as very wealthy white families, Asian, etc. I don't know if you enjoy that.
We do.
In your place too. So I'm picturing families that come into your office and it's a black family, it's a white family, they're young, they've got kids, they're school age. What we face here in Columbia is people don't have to ask a realtor about the schools, they go on the internet. And they figure out which schools have the highest test scores, which schools have the lowest farms rate, and then they tell the realtors where they want to look and where they don't want to look. How do you deal with that?
Well, the way we deal with it is we challenge them on it. So, you know, there's test scores and there's farm percentages and there's all those kinds of things out there, but those don't tell the whole story. So you complete the story for them. You talk about what is available in each one of those schools. You talk about how maybe there are more poor kids in this school than there are in that school, but that doesn't mean it doesn't still have a track team and you know, an orchestra and all those sorts of things. And your kid is going to be able to do that. We also, I mean, it's a little early in the conversation for us to start talking about all the values that we care about, because you know, you're going to overwhelm them in a process when they're just trying to find an apartment, right? But you know, but you can talk about what they brought to you and explain how what they're telling you is there's nothing. I mean, they do the same thing with us. They look at the crime. I mean, we got crime data up the wazoo in Oak Park, right? You know, there's like startup tech organizations that do crime data for every neighborhood in the Chicago region, right? And there's, you know, school data all over the place. Every state has all their schools data online, and everybody knows how to look it up, and everybody does look it up, and everybody goes to Zillow and sees what Zillow says, and everybody does all that sort of stuff.
But let me just interrupt and say, not everybody looks it up. I mean, the people who are educated and a little more affluent, they're the folks who are looking it up. There's a whole bunch of folks that aren't in that category.
Yeah,
that
I bet you're
probably
wrong
are
about
not
that.
looking it up.
I bet you're wrong about that, because because we see everybody at every income level. We see people who come in who have almost no money at all, and they're not going to be able to move to Oak Park. But they've already done that research. They've gone to the library and figured out which part of Oak Park they want to live in. And those people are sometimes like the most adamant, right? Like, I'm already poor. I don't want to be in the poorest school. I want my kid, you know, in this other place so he can get all these things, or she can get all these things, right? So, you know, they're all doing it. And they're, And again, they're getting an incomplete picture. The same way when they go out and look for housing, they're only looking in places that they think are the places that are going to be good for them. So if you start to talk to them and say, I mean, the school that my kid went to is in Southeast Oak Park. I live in the southeast part of the community. For years, it had a bad reputation. And you know, there was some things that actually changed to improve its reputation. But even during those years when it had a bad reputation, there was an effort at the housing center to emphasize what was going on that was good in that community, or in that school. And also to explain that even if there are kids that aren't performing in that school, that doesn't mean your kids aren't performing in that school. You know, there are other factors than test scores and other factors than whether or not somebody gets a free lunch as to whether they're going to perform. And some of those kids who get free lunches perform quite well, thank you. And they're going to be a great peer for your kid. Don't stereotype them before you meet them. You got to get it.
I probably don't need it anyway.
We'll record it, so it'll be good.
Oh, okay. So I'm curious what your neighboring jurisdictions, not necessarily the big regional government and folks in Chicago, but your immediate neighboring communities, whether they look at you now after all this time with envy, or they just refer to you as party jokes of those wackos in Oak Park.
So I think actually they look at us with a combination of envy and disdain. So I think they really, I think a lot of them, you'll hear particularly individuals who live in those communities, particularly in Berwyn and River Forest, somewhat in Austin as well, talk about, boy, I really wish we had a housing center in our community. I really wish you guys were working more in our community. And we would like to be working more in that community, but most of our funding comes from our village, so we can't, rent other people's apartments with our village's money, right? So, and we do a little bit based on the individual donations we give. Anyway, so people will talk about that, and they really wish they had something like us because they wish their community was more like Oak Park. And like River Forest is fine economically, but they still wish that they were doing better on integration than they are. And they often are people who live in River Forest because they couldn't find exactly the house they were looking for in Oak Park, but then they moved to River Forest, right? So they lament that they don't have that. At the same time, as you might have guessed from listening to me for the last whatever, we can talk about ourselves a lot. And we can make it sound like we're really proud of ourselves. And that can be annoying.
We never do that.
And so occasionally you'll get from people like, oh yes, you Oak Parkers, you've got it all figured out. You think you're great, right? And we don't. One of the things that makes us so intentional is we realize we don't have it all figured out, that we have to keep working at it. But, we'd love to talk about what we've done right too, and because that's an important part of our marketing strategy. So, there's a little bit of both. But the problem is what we do does cost money, and some of those communities they're a little afraid to spend it. They're a little afraid, they're not sure they're going to get the same thing that Oak Park got, right? They don't understand that it's really more about the process and putting the program in place. It's not because Oak Park had some magic formula that worked, right? And so you have to convince, like we're working on it right now, trying to convince them that, look, I want you to understand, while Oak Park feels really special, we're really not that different than anywhere else. The only difference is we try. We try. You could try, and you could be like us too. And of course, you have to say it different than that, right? Even saying that, you could be like us, right? That doesn't sound very good. You can say, you can try, and you can get to be where you want to be too, right? So that's really important for people to understand. Like, this is not rocket science, as you can tell. It's me helping somebody find an apartment, right? Not me, my staff. Helping someone find an apartment, right? And helping a landlord figure out how to rent properly. And helping the real estate community join us in that process. And making sure the community has an integration lens on the things that they do. That's all there is. It's that simple. And obviously there's nuance and sophistication to it, but it's not like you have to know how to do calculus to do this, right? You can do it. And anybody can do it if they just try and they care about it and they put the value first.
I'll give you some
community segregated. And it's funny, we were down here and the people said to us, oh my God, you moved to the ghetto of Columbia. Yes, they did. My kids went to Oakland Hills High School, which was a great high school in New York. I guess my question is, I'm in a part of Columbia from that little blue map up there that looks like it's a majority minority.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's other pockets. And I know from graduate school that there's a whole tipping philosophy,
Mhm.
or tipping, I don't know.
The tipping point.
Yeah, where once community is X percent, it used to be, I think, 30,
30 was the number,
it flips over to majority minority.
yeah.
And then you really have to stop it consciously, or it's gonna totally go,
Right.
totally minority.
Well, there's an update to that now. Yeah, that isn't exactly that cut and dried anymore. So the people still do worry about tipping points. I can tell you that for sure. And sociologists still wonder, like, what is a tipping point, or is there a tipping point? And has the tipping point changed over time, as America has changed over time, and our mentality? I mean, one of the great things the Fair Housing Act has done over the last 45 years is it's made us all understand that diversity or discrimination is wrong, right? So that's a good thing. And that people do deserve to have their housing options that they want to choose, right? They can go look at any neighborhood. Now, people don't always allow them to do it, but we sort of agree as a society that that's right. So between that and the changing diversity of the country, I'm not so sure that, like, you can point to a number. And you also have to think about what the community's like that you're in too, right? That's another thing that's sort of out there. Like, you know, maybe in an all-white community, if a neighborhood changed to 20%, it would be a tipping point. But in a community that has had diversity present, you might be able to get to 80%, or say, well, I'd say it's too high. You might be able to get to 40 or 50%, and it might not make a difference because people are expecting to be in a diverse place, right? So so there's some relativity to it, and there's also some change as the community, as America's changed. Regardless of what it is, right? Whether it's 20%, 30%, 50%, the point really is you have to have some kind of intentionality in place to make sure that, you know, it's not too white, too black, too anything, right? If you want that, right? So if that's a value in the community, you will have to work at it, you know, because the status quo is for that not to happen, right? And people's general default setting is going to end up, our society's default setting, this is going to, for that not to happen. So it's important that no matter what that number is, and no matter how that mixture is going to end up, that you have that intentionality in place so that no matter what it ends up being, it's working for your community, right? Because you've built it. It hasn't happened to you. You've created it yourself.
Thank you, sir, for taking time out of your day to answer my question. My question has to do with the fact that as a Haitian American or foreign American integrating into society, like particularly when it comes to the culture and the culture that you come from, when the culture that you come from integrates and wants to integrate, but doesn't necessarily know how because they don't know the power structures that be or how things necessarily work. How, I guess, how in terms, how can you say, how is Oak Forest, I believe?
Oak Park, yeah.
Oak Park. What was Oak Park able to do to help foreign Americans to integrate into society so that they weren't necessarily falling behind pursuing special?
Yeah, you know, it isn't our primary emphasis, I will say. You know, I mean, we just think about it racially and as a primary issue. We do have, you know, a small percentage of foreign-born population that lives in the community. I mean, obviously, we're sensitive to language and cultural barriers that are in the community, and because we're in the Chicago region, there are lots of ways that you can mitigate those issues through translation services and those sorts of things. what we do in addition to that is we just, this particularly happens in like, I can give you a good example of it because it happens in my own life as well, in the Asian community, right? So my wife is South Asian, so, there are, even though we would never have a neighborhood that was the South Asian neighborhood, right? That would be against our principles. But we do have affinity groups in town that meet on a regular basis of South Asians, and we're also part of the group that is just Asians generally, and we're also part of the group that is multiracial families generally. So we have some of those informal structures, I guess, that are put in place, and we're happy to be supportive of those things so that people can have a place to go, to have that space, to talk about the things that are specific to your struggle or to your, whatever's happening in your life, right? And so, we're kind of sensitive to that. And in the institutions that are out there, we're always trying to make sure that, there's, I guess, clarity to what our community culture is like so that you can understand it. I think that happens more in the school system and maybe in the park district than anywhere else because, there's certain sort of Midwest polite kind of standards that go on in our parks, right? And there's, if you're going to try and take over a whole half of the park to do something, that's going to be problematic, right? But if, so those kinds of things. And then in the school, I think there's an intention to, does this family need extra help and extra resources because the parents may not be able to speak English, so they're not going to be helping out as well with homework and this kind of thing. But I don't really know the ins and outs of that, but I know there's something there. Again, it's not our primary emphasis, but I think it's something that we certainly need to be thinking about. But I can't give you a much better answer.
There was a question in the rear, and then was one.
Hi, my name's Dan Schmidt, and my question, I'm not sure that I really understand how the housing market works, so I just want to make that very clear. But my question is about the property value and how that might impact communities. I know that you were talking about raising property values, and I'm just wondering to what extent you're also concerned about maintaining socioeconomic diversity. My understanding is that Columbia was really about that to start with, but as we become a very attractive community, people are more affluent and be moving here, which of course makes it hard to be, lower income living here. And I'm just wondering sort of how you deal with that and to what extent gentrification is a potential sort of side effect of integration sometimes, depending on which way the move is happening, and just kind of how you would think of framing, you're addressing that.
Yeah. We do have things in place to deal with affordability issues. There's a housing authority in our town. They're not a taxing body, but they're quasi-government. And so the PHA, the Oak Park Housing Authority, has 550 voucher holders in our community. That's 3% of our households. So, and it's way higher percentage than any other community in the region, any other suburb. And certainly any middle class suburb. So that's part of it. As we've become more expensive as a community, we've started to entertain tax credit properties in the community. And we had one built about 3 years ago. Was one of the reasons why Dan actually came to Chicago to see Oak Park. And so that's there. We had another one approved by our village, but then they didn't get all the financing they needed, so it didn't get built. We have a very robust social services network in the community, in addition to the township, which provides a lot of things. We have, a homeless prevention organization. We have, another thing that's called Prevail, which provides a lot of social services and support for low-income folks. We have an amazing food pantry for folks. And so we're doing those kinds of things. We're recognizing that the community is definitely sort of, moved from being a moderately to middle class community, moderate, income to middle class community, high middle class community, to mostly high middle class community now. That didn't happen in the rental market until about this year, though. Actually, it did in the homeownership market. But like, for instance, in the homeownership market, what we're recognizing is any home that sells for a modest rate is getting bought by flippers who are gut rehabbing it and turning it into a two-story home instead, and it sells for twice as much as they bought it for. So we're trying to think about what are some strategies that we can keep that from happening, so that you kind of preserve some affordability, but you're also allowing, at least at this point, people who can afford, in Oak Park, that would be maybe like a $250,000 home. So that's pretty average for the Chicago region. Making sure that those are available in the community, not being bought by investors who are going to turn them into $450,000 homes. That just removes any affordable housing in the community. So we're doing things like that, but it always, by the way, comes back to, does this have an effect on our racial integration strategy? Do we need to do this in order to remain racially diverse? In a town like Oak Park, and I'm sure that's probably true in a town like Columbia, you can remain racially diverse and be an expensive community. There are a lot of middle-class people in every racial group that can come to move here. So we don't see the change in affordability as a threat to our racial diversity, but we're a progressive community, so we care about that issue as well. The same way we care about environmental issues, and we care about lots of things that we think progressive people care about. It's a community that voted 88% for Obama, so it gives you an idea of where they stand, right?
There's a question over here, but have you spoken already?
I have.
Okay, so gentleman over here then. And I think we're gonna wind up, I think we'll have a last question.
I'm more confused about some of the questions that people have been asking. So the question that I have is, are the demographics in Columbia, changing such that people who live here feel that they're right? And the Oak Park model, is it better for a place like Columbia, or is it better in Seattle to areas that would be stock cultures?
I can't answer your question about how people feel about Columbia, but I can tell you that I think our model actually is best fit for a suburban environment. It could work in a city, in a neighborhood. It would be very difficult. I actually talked about this before in Baltimore. It would be really difficult for us to open up a Baltimore housing center, right? It's just too big and too many people. But we could pick a neighborhood in Baltimore and say, we're going to turn this into the paradigm of integration for the community, right? And then hopefully it'll be able to radiate out from there. And that's kind of what we're doing in Chicago right now with Austin, which is right next to us, so it's kind of convenient, but it's also a community we think we could work in to try and build integration. But we couldn't do that across the whole city of Chicago at once. In the suburban environment, though, I think we're really set up right because that's what our experience is. It's a suburban experience, and so we kind of know the sensibility that people have when they're moving to the suburbs. The mix of home ownership and rental and those kinds of things is pretty similar. I actually think they're really similar communities in a lot of ways. You're bigger and a little bit more spread out than we are, but otherwise there's the same sort of initial intentionality. As I was driving through the community today, it was clear that one of the things that we do for folks is we actually drive them to an apartment so that they can have all those myths and stereotypes challenged and see it's a great apartment in a great neighborhood with great neighbors. You could do that here. That wouldn't be hard. I think it really feels like the kind of community that our model would work in. And I think, communities like Columbia, communities that are more sort of suburban are probably better suited for us from the get-go. In an urban neighborhood, there's going to be a slightly different situation, right? Because you're going to have even greater density than we have, and you're going to be having to deal with one neighborhood in the whole community. Where if you want to do something here, you have elected bodies that can sort of serve for the whole community, right? In Baltimore, if we wanted to have money provided for one neighborhood, you've got to get the whole city council to say, yeah, we're going to focus on this one neighborhood. I don't know how easy that would be, right?
I guess my question is,
Okay.
the Oak Park rural organization emerged from the union? That same week?
I can't answer that for you. I can't answer, I don't know, I can't answer that for
Okay,
you.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, that's your community's question to answer. And I want you to think about, like, this doesn't, I think I know where you're going with this, and I might be wrong, but I'm gonna go ahead and put myself out there. The need in Oak Park wasn't like, oh, we're gonna flip, you know. I mean, there was some need there. But there was an additional concern that we didn't want to become a hostile community, right? So we were an all-white community when we started, right? And the communities that were surrounding us, including the ones that are predominantly Latino now and predominantly African American, those communities were really, really hostile to people of color 20 years ago, not to mention 40 years ago. I mean, if you would have told somebody 25 years ago that Cicero was going to be 90% Latino in 20 years, they would have laughed at you like you were a crazy person. Because it was a white town that didn't like people of color, trust me. And so those changes happened. But also, like, Oak Parkers saw that was what was going on in these other communities. That was how they were going to stop what happened in Austin and their community. And they were just like, we won't do that. We're not going to be that way. We're not going to say no to people of color who want to move to our town. But we're also not going to say no, or we're not going to say yes to real estate agents just taking one block by block and scaring the Jesus out of the folks who live here. That's not acceptable.
Yeah. Columbia was never that type of land.
Right.
Okay, it was
Yeah.
built on diversity or integration, diversity, equality. Okay, but still, at least to my knowledge, still has that reputation and that self-serious self. What's bothering me is that, given the presentation, I was wondering whether that's true.
So we haven't, we have the Columbia Association, we haven't done a lot of detailed analysis that I could present to you today. And it really was about building on our legacy that we have in the community. We're about to celebrate our 50th anniversary as a community next year. And it is built into the community. But how can we make sure to sustain it? I think earlier was said when people came here early on, they chose to come to Columbia for a reason. Now people come to those great open spaces, great schools, and maybe also because they find that they are comfortable and they enjoy living in a diverse and an interracial community and an integrated community. But there are areas that, you know, if you look at that map, you can see it yourself. So again, we have not done analysis. It's not like we did the analysis, we found a problem, and we invited Rob to speak. It's more about making sure, do we want to be proactive in our community that's based on equity and based on integration to maintain that. So there's not like somebody set a red flag, we got to get out here by tomorrow and do this. It's really about us, and that's why we had Rob put these questions up here. Is there something we want to do, and how could we do it here? So, Rob, you want to say some last remarks?
Yeah, I will say one last thing.
We'll be here to speak with you.
And yeah, I mean, that's really the key, right? What do you want? You know, because even though we, you know, tipping points and all that sort of stuff, there's still, I mean, one of the things I always tell people, and this is kind of how we looked at it in Oak Park, like individuals can never do anything wrong, right? If, you know, like even if you never did anything wrong, try to say this the right way in a good sentence, you don't have to do anything wrong for bad things to happen because the system will do the dirty work for you.
Yes.
Okay? So you might need to put a system in place to keep that bad thing from happening, right? Even though it's not because you feel like we failed at what we're trying to do, right? Or that this community isn't what it used to be or something like that. But you know that you're fighting against a really big force, right? Segregation, right? And if you want to be able to continue, it's much easier to be proactive about it than to be reactive about it. If you don't do anything, and all of a sudden, and you wait until, you know, there's a village that has changed to be all one group, right? That might be too late because it's really, really hard to undo bad things. It's a lot easier to do good things. So.
That's a great note to end on, please.